And welcome once again to Why Should We Care About the Indo-Pacific, a very special edition because it's just us. It is me, Ray Powell, the former military officer. There's Jim Carouso, the former diplomat. We have no guest because we are talking about an emerging story that we wanted to cover very quickly. And having just returned from Manila, I had kind of a close-up view of how this was going down in the Philippines. So what happened? We're talking about, of course, this recent incident in which a Chinese destroyer was struck along its port bow by a China Coast Guard ship. The China Coast Guard ship came out much the worse for wear, with basically the entire bow crumpled up like a sardine can. And all of this happened while chasing a Philippine Coast Guard ship near Scarborough Shoal. So there's so much to talk about on this. So we want to, but before we do, we want to quickly give a shout out to our producer, Ian Ellis Jones and IEJ Media, and our sponsor, Bauer Group Asia. We'll tell you more about them in due course. Finally, I did want to give a quick shout out to a guy named Tim. Tim, you know who you are, who grabbed me at a hotel in Manila recently and said, "Hey, I really like that podcast you're doing." So thanks, Tim. We just wanted to give you a shout out since you were kind enough to stop me in the lounge and tell us how much you like what we're doing. So, Jim Carouso, I am back, as you can see, in California. Unfortunately, although I am not much worse for wear, my car is, because the car that I left sitting out in front, apparently the rodents like it there at night when nobody's driving it for over a month, and they chewed up most of the wiring harness and a good part of the other stuff underneath the hood. So it is now in the shop, and the insurance is now involved, and the rodent damage apparently is a big thing around here.
Well, I suppose you're going to blame this on the Global Times also.
Well, let's talk more about the Global Times in due course, because boy, that's an interesting part of this entire story.
All right. So just back from a month, 6 weeks in Manila, yep. And the vow.
Yep.
And while you're there, there's this, I encourage all our listeners, you've got to watch the video, because it's almost like it's scripted, because you see this big Chinese Coast Guard ship chasing this little Philippine Coast Guard ship, and the Philippine ship is trying to evade it, and water cannons going off. And suddenly, out of nowhere, comes this big old honking Chinese destroyer, and destroyer is the name because it destroyed the front of this Chinese vessel.
Yeah,
just came barreling through. So, all right, so let's start with putting this in context. What was the situation that gave rise to this?
Okay, so interestingly, Jim and you and I were both involved in an online symposium back in May where we talked a lot about how we got here with Scarborough Shoal. And of course, you can go back to, let's say, about 2012 is probably just as a touch point, because that was when China essentially took control of the shoal, took sort of unitary control of the shoal during an incident that is, most people sort of harken back to 2012 as sort of when the sea change really happened around Scarborough Shoal. And it became something that China really after that, China really was calling the shots on who got to get in and out of Scarborough Shoal. And since then, of course, the other big touch point was in 2016, the Philippines got their arbitral ruling from The Hague, from this arbitral tribunal in The Hague, which essentially said nothing about who owns Scarborough Shoal, but said that fishermen from all countries that have traditionally done fishing at Scarborough Shoal should be allowed to continue fishing at Scarborough Shoal. Okay, now fast forward to 2024. So let's just put it into last year. Say spring of last year, we began to see a big change in how the China Coast Guard, the China Maritime Militia were keeping people out of Scarborough Shoal. And we began to see the building of what we began to call an exclusion zone around 25 to 30 nautical miles around the shoal. And so that basically Philippine government vessels could no longer get inside.
And just remind us how far Scarborough Shoal is from Mindanao, from the
from Luzon, yes, from the coast there. I think that it's somewhere up around 150 50 or so nautical miles. The exact measurement, it's within the exclusive economic zone of the Philippines. In a legal sense, it gets a little complicated because Scarborough Shoal is considered, because some part of Scarborough Shoal is above water at high tide. It makes it more than just a what we call a low tide elevation. It becomes at least what we call a rock. I know it's a big technical term, but it is actually a technical term in UNCLOS, in the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea, as a rock. And in the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea, a rock is something that is essentially at above high tide, above water at high tide, but it is not big enough or there's not enough of it to sustain life in and of its own. So why that's important is, as a rock, it gets to sort of have it's considered territory, which means that somebody can own territory. It could belong to somebody, which is different than, and then it could generate a 12 nautical mile territorial sea, which somebody would also then own.
Right, but clearly not a 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone, just a 12-mile nautical limit.
Yeah, so right. So a 200 nautical mile would be an exclusive economic zone, which the Philippines has, and it extends beyond Scarborough Shoal. If there were some kind of international body that were to rule that that Scarborough Shoal belonged to China, for example, then we could say, well, clearly then that part of the Philippine exclusive economic zone doesn't fall in their, ambit. It would be separated out and say, okay, but this belongs to China. Of course, nobody's done that. And so China has essentially been trying to create facts on the ground that can say, yeah, basically this is ours. And then, we have exclusive control of it, exclusive rights to it.
Right. And so what they've been doing is keeping out the fishermen from the Philippines who've been fishing in this area for years.
Yes.
Keeping them out. And now we have, the other day, a Philippine Coast Guard vessel basically escorting some Philippine fishermen to the shoal. Is that what was going on?
Yeah, a little bit. So what we had, a total of 5 vessels involved, large vessels from the Philippine side. There were 2 Coast Guard, including the one you saw in the video, 2 fisheries, we call Bureau of Fisheries and Aquatic Resources, or BFAR, so smaller vessels that basically support the fisheries. And then they brought out this fish carrier, which they use to support a program they call Kadiwa. And that is essentially to say they're going to send out this fish carrier and they are going to distribute fuel and water and food and other things to the fishermen so they can stay out longer. And also they're going to, so in many cases, just buy their fish directly from them so they don't have to go back to shore, so they can stay out.
There are Philippine fishermen already out there.
Yes. So these are fishermen who are already going to be out, right? So they can, this allows them to stay out longer. And besides being nice for Philippine fishermen, one is it helps solve a problem that the fishermen are having, which is they used to be able to go all the way into Scarborough Shoal. There was much better fish. It was much better protected. They could sort of do all the fishing that they needed to do. They could sort of shuttle the fish back and forth with somewhat larger boats from their smaller boats. So this system worked for them for centuries. They can no longer do that. China is not letting them inside the shoal anymore. In fact, from all reports, they are not letting them within, say, 30 nautical miles of the shoal, maybe even 40, because they've set up this exclusion zone. So a solution to this is using these fish carriers to go out and support the fishermen who are now more exposed, and it's a lot tougher fishing because they're not inside this protected area where the fish were much more available.
Right, but so these fishermen were not anywhere near Scarborough Shoal. They were outside 30 or 40 miles?
They've been kept well outside of Scarborough Shoal, probably for at least a year.
Okay, so how did the Philippine Coast Guard vessel get into a tiff with the Chinese counterpart?
Well, one of the interesting things about this whole thing is the Philippine Coast Guard vessel was not broadcasting on its automatic information system. So AIS is what I use as a ship tracker with SeaLight to kind of keep up with what's going on out there. And so the BRP Suluan did not have its AIS turned on. So neither, by the way, did the Coast Guard vessel, number 3104, or the PLA destroyer. PLA Navy, like the U.S. Navy, never turns on AIS, and they're not required to under UNCLOS. So None of these three vessels were broadcasting. What makes that interesting is that may have contributed to the fact that the Suluan, from the reports that we got from the Philippine side, got within 10.5 nautical miles of Scarborough Shoal. Well, that's kind of an interesting number because that's less than 12, right? Which would be the territorial sea that Scarborough Shoal might earn if it happened to belong to somebody, especially China. So China has been trying to keep everybody out. They've had this big exclusion zone. If the Suluan got in much deeper than that, that means that would be one of the only ships that we've seen in well over a year to actually get into, or at least close to, the edge of the shoal. So
clearly this was not in support of any particular Philippine fisherman. This was
right.
apparently laying a claim or challenging Chinese.
I think more of the latter. I think more, challenge. Yeah. So the Philippines needs to be able to show that they have not just given up on Scarborough Shoal, right? If they, it's one of these things where if you stop even trying, then you have, again, you've helped create facts on the ground. So they need to be able to demonstrate that they are still interested in their claim to Scarborough Shoal. And so, the Suluan apparently was able to get in pretty deep and, reasonably close to the shoal.
And it seems to have elicited a reaction.
It seems to. And so that's the other really fascinating thing about this is that the three ships involved, if you were just sort of watching the China Coast Guard ship chasing the Philippine ship around, you might say, hey, that's pretty distressing, but we've seen things like this before. But seeing this big gray-hulled destroyer just, come flashing in from the left side of your screen was really jarring. And not just because there's this, obviously you have these three ships in such close quarters. And then of course, the fact that they collided with the China Coast Guard ship. The other thing, it was extremely close to the Philippine Coast Guard ship. But let's go back to the fact that it was there at all, right? Because up until now, we really have not seen the Navy get directly involved in these interactions. We've seen lots of the Coast Guard, lots of the maritime militia. Navy has tended to stay over on the horizon. And all of a sudden, and this gave China a little bit of a veneer of, sort of respectability. Well, we've got the Coast Guards involved. They're doing law enforcement. This is all reasonable law enforcement stuff. Water cannons are law enforcement weapons. And by keeping the Navy out, they sort of were able to sort of keep everyone calm and say, yeah, this is just normal law enforcement stuff. Well, all of a sudden, having the Navy directly involved is a big change.
Okay. Now, prior to this, there was more Chinese activity around the shoal anyway. Is that right?
Yeah. And so we had been tracking definitely a large increase, especially since about May of last year. And then even within the last couple of months, we've seen an uptick even above that. So we've seen, say, where perhaps more than a year and a half ago, we might have seen one Coast Guard ship, maybe a couple of militia. Then starting last year, that would have been, say, 3 or 4 Coast Guard ships, half a dozen militia. And now just recently, we've been seeing 7, 8 Coast Guard ships and, say, 14, 15 militia.
Okay. Was there anything that seemed to trigger this increased activity?
I think that what China has been doing, so, a couple other big things have happened in the last year and a half or so. One is back in early last year, early last year, China made a new law, basically a law enforcement law, Coast Guard law, or an interpretation of a Coast Guard law that essentially said that if you get caught within our territory, we can detain you up to 60 days without trial. And that was happening at about the same time as there was a Philippine civil society group called Atin Ito, which basically means it's ours, that was planning to take this big group of fishermen out to Scarborough Shoal. And so announcing this thing seemed to be a direct threat to things like that. Say, don't show up and think that if you show up like that, we might just take you back to China. And we don't even have to even talk to you for 60 days, and then maybe we'll have a trial. Okay, so that was big. And then the next big thing is the thing that one other thing we talked about during our May symposium was the fact that over the summertime, the Chinese fishing fleet, which especially their giant clam harvesting, all those ships disappeared. At the same time as China was putting out a report saying the condition of Scarborough Shoal is great. And there's lots of evidence suggesting that the condition of Scarborough Shoal is not great. And one of those pieces of evidence is they took all the fishing ships out because the giant clam harvesters were primarily responsible for what we suspect the condition of the shoal is. And then the other thing that happened is in November, China declared what we call straight baselines around the shoal. So they basically said, they put all these points out there. I think there were something like 14 of them. And they said, these are the baselines of the shoal. And in nautical terms or in maritime law terms, you're allowed, if you are a coastal state, let's say you've got a coast and you're trying to draw the territorial sea. If you've got a bunch of islands that are just around the coast, or if you've got inlets, you're allowed to sort of draw a baseline around those and say, measure our territorial sea from these islands that are just right here. You're not really allowed to go to this isolated reef all the way out in the middle of the sea somewhere, hundreds of miles from your coast and say, and we've got baselines around that too. But China did that. So I think that was another marker in this process of saying, this is ours. We're not letting you in. Because the day of everybody gets to play around in Scarborough Shoal is over, because we are now saying that it is unequivocally China's.
Now, I'm willing to bet the Chinese would argue that President Marcos has gotten more aggressive in stating his claims to Philippine rights in the West Philippine Sea and to Scarborough Shoal, and so has ratcheted up tensions because of that.
Well, I'm certainly they will like to claim that. It is certainly true. Obviously, President Marcos has been very open about his concern. I think they like to use the term not 1 inch. They don't want to give up 1 inch of their claims. So all of that is true. As we talked about in our last podcast, when we talked about Rodrigo Duterte, he obviously has a much different approach to this than Duterte did, and a much different approach to China and the United States. So that's all true. And of course, they've also had this transparency program. And one of the reasons that the whole world knows that these two Chinese ships hit each other is because there were reporters on the ships, on the Philippine ships, including a very, very good photojournalist, a guy named Rafi Tima, who was actually on the back of the Philippine Coast Guard ship, the Suluan, with a high-powered camera and video. And that's why we all know, and why no amount of denial from the Chinese side, if they said anything at all, which they haven't, can make it different. I mean, we all know exactly what happened. Okay, so the real lucky part of this was it didn't hit the Philippine ship. This destroyer going at however fast it was, but it looked really fast. Really fast, and it was really close. So it would have caused serious damage, if not injuries or deaths. Yeah, I mean, I saw one report that even the flagstaff on the back of the Philippine ship was damaged. So that's how close it was. Yeah. Okay. So what does this say? Is it now China's willing to take, you might as well call it kinetic action, to satisfy their claim? So that's scary. And not just kinetic action. So kinetic action directly involving the Navy, right? Now, so let's go back, a year ago this summer. So last June, or actually late May, President Marcos was at the Shangri-La dialogue and was asked specifically, what would cause him to consider China's actions against the Philippines an armed attack. And he said, well, if a Philippine sailor dies, that's pretty much crosses the line into an act of war. Well, you can easily see how what happened on Monday could have resulted not in the death of just one, but many Philippine sailors. In fact, we suspect that several Chinese sailors on the Coast Guard ship were killed. And in fact, we saw search patterns for about the next day and a half from the China Coast Guard and Maritime Militia, clearly looking for something or someone. And I would bet that they did not succeed in finding them, because just the amount of sea that they were looking over and the length of time, it's probable that they probably lost some people. Well, this is a good time to remind everyone that there is a treaty alliance between the U.S. and Philippines. Indeed. The U.S. has pledged to defend the Philippines against attacks, extending to
offshore islands.
Yeah.
It's made very clear. Have we heard anything from the Pentagon or the White House about this?
We haven't. It is, I think a lot of the usual statements were made. I think that maybe people are being almost a little too restrained in how they've looked at this, because the fact that we nearly had what you're describing, we nearly had a Chinese Navy ship ram a Philippine Coast Guard ship with potentially catastrophic result. I don't know if you remember, Jim, during my interview with 60 Minutes last year, they asked me specifically about this question, and because they had been on a ship that was hit by a China Coast Guard ship, it was rammed, right? And so I said, look, you were just on a ship that was rammed. What if your ship had sunk? What if people had been killed? Would the Philippines in that case not be justified in saying this was an armed attack? Well, how much more if it's a Philippine Navy ship that hits a 44-meter Coast Guard ship broadside and causes catastrophic damage and even perhaps sinks the ship and kills a lot of people. So, yeah, I think that, China really is playing with fire here.
All right. So we're going to assume that the Chinese Navy was under instruction to take this sort of action. Or do you think this guy was freelancing?
I think there may have been a bit of freelancing. Here's kind of, I'm trying to think of what would make the most sense to me. Again, I don't have knowledge about what their rules of engagement were, but, just in terms of up until now, they kept the Navy out of it. So here they have these Philippine ships, all of them sort of begin to approach, all but one are kept outside of the usual exclusion zone. And this one ship manages to get itself within 10 and a half nautical miles of Scarborough Shoal. I could almost see it that, the driver of this Navy ship is saying, all right, playtime is over. Now it's time to bring in the big guns. This can't happen. We can't allow this. Because at this point, the only ships in sight are the one Philippine Coast Guard or the one China Coast Guard ship and this big Navy vessel. And the Navy vessel may have just decided it was time to end this right here.
All right, but I just want to say, why ram it? Why not shoot at it if that's the goal?
Well, so that the question is, did it intend to ram? I don't think it necessarily intended to ram the Coast Guard ship. I think it probably intended to pass very, very close astern, and just scare the heck out of the crew. Because what they're trying to do is they're trying to get the Philippine side to sort of just say, we don't want to get anybody killed, so we will back off. We're going to stop trying to test the limits of this exclusion zone. So I don't think he intended to ram the Philippine ship. But it wouldn't have taken much to be, he obviously judged wrong when it came to the China Coast Guard ship. So, you could see this going the other way.
Yeah, it's as you said at the outset, there's so many questions here.
Yeah.
So let me give you the American paranoid view, which could be, Xi and Trump are having this little dance about trade. And Trump has sort of made nice. He's lifted limits on some advanced chips to China, given another extension of 90 days to reach agreement on the trade deal. Trump clearly trying to do a deal with China. Is this China saying, all right, you want to do a deal? Let's see how badly you want to do it.
I think that those two things are only loosely connected. So I can't draw a straight line. I think that in my head, here's what's been going on is for a couple of years now, this little pipsqueak country that, doesn't deserve to be on the same map as big bad China has been poking China in the eye, in China's view, right? And, China believes that their time has come. And certainly the smaller countries on its periphery should know the deal. They should understand that they can't play in the same pool as the big boys. And yet the Philippines keeps insisting. And so I think that not only in Beijing, but just sort of, especially amongst the Navy, the Coast Guard, others, there is a frustration that why is this still happening? The Philippines should be put in its place. And so I can easily see, and remember, another thing, there was an article just a couple of days ago in the proceedings in the U.S. Naval Institute. I'm sorry, I don't remember the name of the author off the top of my head, but asked the questions, what was the role of the political officer on board the Chinese ship in this case? Because remember, in the Chinese system, you have kind of parallel commands. You have an operational command that goes down through the captain, and you have a political command that goes through the political officer, sort of back to the Chinese Communist Party. To what extent did political considerations in this way sort of override, sort of normal operational prudence, if you would? So you can almost see this going almost any way, and we will never know the answer to this question. But I think, it helps to sort of take a step back and remember 24 years ago, and during the first year of the Bush administration, before anybody knew anything about what was going to happen on 9/11, the big foreign, Asia-Pacific, Indo-Pacific issue of the year was the downing of the P-3 that was sort of forced to land at Hainan Island after being hit by a Chinese fighter jet. And of course, the fighter pilot died and was then, sort of lionized as a national hero. Well, guess what? I don't think that the captains of either of these two Chinese ships is going to be lionized. They are going to be sort of, put down the memory hole somewhere. I think that their careers will probably come to an ignominious end because they've caused national embarrassment to Beijing. I mean, under normal circumstances, even in the United States, somebody would be held accountable. But here, I don't think we'll ever know their names. But it does, thinking back to that 2001 incident and how they have sort of made this fighter pilot famous as a national hero, you can kind of understand why a Navy captain might think, you know what? I mean, my best interests, my best career interests lie in being more aggressive, not more prudent.
Well, does that change that equation after this event?
I don't know. I mean, certainly nobody is going to want to do this. So whatever it changes, it certainly will make it that. I think that even though we will never know the name of the captain involved, people in the Chinese Navy will be well aware that you do not want to cause national embarrassment to Beijing or international embarrassment to Beijing in the way that they have. So that may, there may be some dialing back just in terms of that. But I think there will also be a parallel impulse to say, now we've really had it with the Philippines.
Yes. All right. So you're advising President Marcos. What do you say to do? Go even closer. See if they'll ram another ship of theirs.
Yeah. So I mean, this is really, and I think that President Marcos is almost certainly with his cabinet trying to think all this through, but it's not the first time they've had to think something like this through, right? They had last June, we had the big incident out at Second Thomas Shoal where the sailor lost a thumb, and there were, they kind of came to the brink. And at that point, interestingly enough, came up with some kind of accommodation afterwards where now Second Thomas Shoal resupply missions go out without incident. So there may be, I'm sure there'll be navel gazing on both sides to some degree. I would worry that, it's in a perverse way, this could almost be looked at by some in Beijing as an opportunity to push harder and think, this freaked us out a little bit, but if it freaked them out, then this is an opportunity for us to really ratchet it down. I have a hard time thinking that they will lessen their commitment to their current strategy of exclusion.
Yeah, I think that sounds about right. One way to tell how they're reacting is by looking at their media. And the media, as far as I know, has basically not reported on it, except for the accusation that it was all the Philippine ship's fault.
Right. Whatever just happened, this thing that just happened that we're not going to say what it is all the Philippines' fault.
Right. Whatever it is.
Yeah. Right. So they caused a problem at what they call China's Huangyandao, or what they call Scarborough Shoal. They caused this problem, but no, there is no mention, certainly no images of what actually did happen to these two Chinese ships in Chinese media anywhere. It is one of those things where, because they are trying to present the information internationally, they're stuck, right? On one hand, they can't show the thing that is the story, and yet they have to say something about the story.
WVPN.
It's, so the question is, does your average Chinese citizen ever hear about the collision of these two ships? I doubt it. There may be a few people who figure it out, and some people who are traveling internationally will learn about it and tell their families. So, some of it may leak out, but I mean, think of the extent to which Tiananmen Square has been memory holed in most of China.
Right. So I think if there's a silver lining in this, I'm hoping it's that it reminds the political leadership in Beijing that when you're doing things with things that go boom, you don't know what's going to happen.
Yeah.
So don't assume you can take Taiwan without serious problems.
Yeah. And
especially so if you're just laying waste to the senior echelon of your military.
You're talking about the purges,
Yeah, the purges are amazing. So, but the problem, as always, is in a lot of systems where the leader only gets good news.
Yeah.
What does Xi think and know, and what's he demanding?
He's kind of you can't hide it from him. I don't think you can hide this from him.
Right.
What he thinks is another thing. I do think it does bring into question what is the level of coordination, tactical coordination that happens between the military, the Coast Guard, the militia, right? And part of the reason that's so interesting a question, one, of course, is clearly there was a failure of that coordination in this instance, but there's going to need to be a lot of it if there is going to be action around Taiwan, right? Because the whole idea is a lot of the force that is going to be needed for a real invasion would be civilian forces, right? It'd be civilian ships turned into transports, that kind of a thing, right? It would be a high involvement by the Coast Guard. For example, if there's a quarantine or a blockade of Taiwan, the Coast Guard would be deeply involved in that. So what we may be learning is, these are, even though the PLA Navy or the PLA generally is supposed to be in charge of these things when it comes down to it, the level of day-to-day tactical coordination probably isn't very high.
Do we know if they use the same communications systems, the Navy and the Coast Guard?
I don't. Somebody probably does. I do not. I'm sure that they can talk to one another, but to the level to which they're integrated is probably, I would venture to guess it's probably not as good as, say, within the Navy, so.
Well, if we learn nothing else from Cool Hand Luke, a failure to communicate has consequences.
Exactly. So what we have, boy. Well, sorry. Yet another old man pop culture reference that I'm sure everyone will get.
You should see the movie.
Yeah.
We may eat an egg again.
So we should talk about, there were actually a couple of other incidents this week.
Whoa.
Yeah. So there's been another close encounter in the air where a Philippine Coast Guard aircraft, basically a Cessna, was harassed by another Chinese fighter jet. Now, it wasn't at the scale of the P3 incident, back in 2001, and it wasn't even like last year where they released some flares. But it was an incident, and it was, so the Philippine Coast Guard did send out an aircraft to figure out what was going on out there, and there was harassment by a Chinese fighter jet. And then we all woke up this morning to find out that one of the things that the Chinese state media was good for was alerting us to the fact that there apparently had been a U.S. freedom of navigation operation going by Scarborough Shoal, which brings up lots of questions that I have, which I don't think have been answered. And maybe we won't get answers to those either. But one of the first ones is, did we plan this a long time ahead of time, like we usually do with bon ops, as we call them? Or was this something that we decided after this incident, which would be, which would raise my eyebrows? So
that'd be pretty quick.
It would be. I mean, and you'd have to sort of get lucky to some degree, because you have to say, okay, these vessels are in the area, so let's go ahead and we'll just reroute them, for a FONOP. So I can imagine it happening. But if it was pre-planned, then the timing is exquisite.
Maybe that's why the Philippine vessel went into Scarborough Shoal when it did.
What's that? Say that again?
Maybe that's why the Philippine vessel got so close to Scarborough Shoal.
Because it knew there was a FONOP? So it would actually, there's obviously a lot of operational sharing between the U.S. and the Philippines, so it could have happened. One of the weird things about FONOPs, we should talk about what they are, because not everybody understands them. So Freedom of Navigation Operations is a program that the U.S. Navy has had for over 4 decades, and by which they essentially back up the U.S. fidelity toward the treaty it never signed, the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea. We agreed to it, but we've never got it all the way through the Senate and had it ratified. So it's one of those really strange situations where China, which signed the treaty, does not abide by the treaty, especially in the South China Sea, and the U.S., which did not ratify the treaty, and we're always reminded about that, actually not only do we abide by it, we assertively, we basically say, we're going to go by this place because it is our right under international law to do so. And if we don't do it, then nobody will do it. And that will mean that your excessive claim, the thing that says that you should control more water than you actually should, then that becomes de facto law.
And just to remind everyone, we exercise these FONOPs all over the world, including on allies.
Yes. I believe you and I were in Australia at the time when there was a rumor that we were going to do a FONOP around Australia, and it caused a great deal of consternation amongst our allies. Ultimately, the answer to the question was, yeah, but that kind of is the program. And by doing it here, it gives us the credibility to do it everywhere else, because we can say this is just a worldwide program. And so it's not targeting China per se. It's just that China has so many claims, so many excessive claims, that you almost can't help but do more against China than you do against others. But this particular one would be what we call an innocent passage FONOP. They haven't said that, at least that I've seen, but that would be logical, because being a ROC under international law, we would normally take those 2 ships and we would just sail in a straight line, not doing any maneuvers. We would say, under innocent passage, even though we recognize that somebody has the right to a 12 nautical mile territorial sea around Scarborough Shoal, we're not saying who it is. Even if somebody has it, if we're going through the territorial sea because it's the straightest line to where we're going, which is what innocent passage is, we're going to go in a straight line and not do any maneuvers.
Do you know how close we got to the shoal?
No.
Who did the FONOP?
No. And oftentimes these are not sort of, that kind of information is not put out. So, but if it was innocent passage, and it's almost certainly within 12 nautical miles, because that would be what a FONOP essentially would be in that case, right? Because China wouldn't have any claim outside. So the other thing that will happen is if you have a claim that goes beyond 12 nautical miles, and you say, well, you can't come out here either, then we'll do that, but we won't do it in an innocent passageway. We'll actually do maneuvers just to sort of demonstrate the fact that we're allowed to do maneuvers outside 12 nautical miles. But that's probably not what happened here.
All right, we're coming up on time. So let's try and sum up if there are any lessons we can take from this, because a lot of what we've been saying is, I don't know.
Yep.
But it's bad.
It's bad. And I think that people ought to be peering into the abyss a little bit and having some serious discussions about how bad this could have been, right? And so back to the question of the Mutual Defense Treaty, have we sort of thought through what we would do if something like that, this is what war games are for. And I will say on the military side of things, I think we do quite a pretty good job of wargaming things. So we do it all the time. We get people together and, we have these high level discussions about what would we do if this or that happens. And so it wouldn't surprise me if we had wargamed this, say, at Indo-Pacific Command or somewhere else, or even in the Pentagon. The question is, how much of that is happening at the White House, at the National Security Council? How much of that thought? Because ultimately, the decisions are going to be made by the President of the United States. And, you would like to think I know we would both like to think. And, I mean, and this is not just about, whether the president's name is Trump. It's really under any president, there's only so much time that a president has. And what you usually hope is that at least that president is listening to people around him or her who are actually thinking about this and maybe have taken part in one or two of these war games and have had these deep thoughts. The thing about this sort of seat of the pants presidency is we're not really sure if that happens or not.
I think that's the understatement of the year. Okay.
You hope that, the instincts that he relies on are the right instincts, but it is one of those things that reminds us that this is a serious world that we live in. And a lot of us live in kind of a universe that doesn't want to think about things like that. And you and I complained last year that during all of the debates that we had leading up to the presidential election, questions about stuff like the Taiwan Strait and the South China Sea never came up. They talked about golf games, but they didn't talk about, what might happen in a situation like this.
Well, because there are no good answers.
Well, there aren't. And honestly, the American people, and this is just reality. I mean, they don't think about this very much, which is why we have a podcast, is because we hope to inspire people to think about this stuff some more, because it could really impact their lives in a massive way. If the United States goes to war with China, God forbid, all of the things that we've been talking about, about even, this week, about, say, policing in Washington, D.C. are important, but, compared to this issue, they would be considered trivial.
Well, and if Philippines was basically attacked and the U.S. did not go to defend its ally, what does that mean for the alliance system and for the whole structure of deterrence?
Yep.
So either way, it's a real mess.
Yes.
And you're not there to clean it up anymore.
Yes, because I did such a good job of cleaning it up when I was in the military.
You had the mop.
But fortunately, we have diplomats like Jim Carouso to clean it up for us.
What a mess.
What a mess. All right. Yeah. Well, before we go, we probably have time for a little bit of a story. You got anything in mind? We usually talk about this off air.
Tell me about your trip to the Philippines. Anything different from your trip?
So we talked about, what Davao was like and sort of the political environment down there during our last podcast, which people should go back and listen to. But that was, certainly one of my takeaways was, much like in the United States, things can get extremely tribal. And in Davao City, the Duterte, I went by one big sign, and Rodrigo Duterte, who is in The Hague under international arrest, essentially awaiting trial, is the mayor of Davao and was elected while he was sitting in The Hague. The vice mayor is his son. The two congressmen from that region are both named Duterte. So you're reminded that this, looking ahead to 2028, and of course the vice president is Duterte, that the question of who is the president in 2028 is a big question and very much an unresolved one.
Well, we have no problems like that here. We have no Dutertes.
No, we have everything. It's a good thing America has such normal politics.
That's what we're calling it now. Okay.
Exactly. All right. Well, we do want to make sure we give our shout out, as usual, to our producer, Ian Ellis Jones and IEJ Media, and thank them for all the work that they put into putting our podcast into your ears. Please do follow Ian on X, where he puts out those outstanding military and geopolitical graphics. At Ian Ellis Jones is his handle, at Ian Ellis Jones. Of course, if you enjoyed this, hit the subscribe button, whether it be on your podcast or your YouTube channel. I was just listening to another podcast, Jim, in which they challenged their audience to get them up over 20,000 subscriptions on YouTube. And of course, my first thought was, well, we got more than that. But my second is, boy, I wonder if the secret is we've got to beg more. Please, please, please hit the subscribe button.
Do you remember the old National Lampoon cover with a guy holding a gun and said, "Buy this magazine or we'll shoot this dog"?
I do remember that.
Right.
But I was way too highbrow to read National Lampoon, of course.
Yeah, you were mad. Anyway.
Exactly. You can certainly check us out on YouTube, youtube.com at the IP podcast. And that's where you hit that thumb so that you, or the bell or whatever it is that we hit on YouTube. I can't remember anymore. And then, of course, you can follow us on social media. We're on X, we're on LinkedIn, we're on Blue Sky. You can find us there. If you want to go back and listen to a couple, the last couple that we did, as we said, are very, very appropriate. One was, of course, the one that we just released. Why should we care about the Xi Duterte love affair? Something to that effect. And then we did right before that, we had President Whips on from Palau talking about why should we care about the tiny Pacific island country standing up to China. Lastly, you can email us. We are collecting your emails. We're actually thinking about how to respond to some of them during our upcoming 100th episode. So this is a great time to email us, and who knows, you might hear your email read on air. And finally, our thanks to our sponsor, Powell Group Asia. They are a strategic advisory firm that specializes in the Indo-Pacific. They apply unmatched expertise and experience to help clients navigate the world's most complex and dynamic markets. Jim Carouso is a senior advisor with Powell Group, and you can find them at their website, powellgroupasia.com. And we thank you for joining us this time. Until next time, I'm Ray. That's Jim. Thanks, Ian. Until next time on Why Should We Care About the Indo-Pacific?